If you like exploring Neoplatonism and how it blends with Christianity, how philosophy has left a deep stamp on even traditional forms of this faith, how you can weave yourself through the entire philosophical spectrum and land yourself in a Christian point of view, if you think about it hard enough, stay tuned. Welcome to Biblioccultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Also remember to follow me on X. I will put the information here in the screen. And if you're interested in my merch, go to the link in the beginning of my video description, and you can get some items there that will help promote the channel. And also, I try to put designs that I use usually that I think are pretty cool and work well with the aesthetics of this project. And I really appreciate you doing all these things. In this episode, I'm going to go through From Plato to Christ by Louis Markos. This edition is by InterVarsity Press, and it's from 2021. I think really there's only two editions, like a hardback and a softcover. I have a softcover. Like I always say, content is king, which means that you can get whichever edition you can find. And the book's premise is quite interesting, but I like reducing it to the idea that Plato himself, even though he was not a Christian, received some kind or some form of revelation. Now, this idea has been floating around for thousands of years. Some of the church fathers argued that even though most of Greek philosophy was not in tune with Christianity, that a lot of these philosophers were being somehow inspired by God to pre-illustrate Christian theology. Now, of course, to some people, they would argue that this is because for Christians, Greek philosophy was needed to give it a framework, so that if you're cynical, you would argue that Christianity is indeed a form of philosophical Hebraism. A lot of this comes from the theory that a lot of the different schools of thought of Second Temple Judaism were highly influenced by Hellenizing culture. And at the time, people spoke about Hellenized Judahites. And this is the case with Philo and other thinkers at the time. Among the first Christians, the Greeks are an important part of the development of the community, so it's very difficult to not see a connection, especially in terminology. But that is fallacious to simply say that because they share in terminology, they share in philosophy. They do not. But this book in particular is actually going into that idea and making the case that you could be a Neoplatonic Christian of some sort, and it would make sense. The book speaks of Plato's philosophy bridging monistic and pluralistic views of existence, so that in the ancient world you would have a split between this notion of an immanent, ever-changing, ever-morphing existence, matter, etc. And you would also have another view, like the monistic one, in which everything is really a unity and there's not really much of variety and change. A lot of it is illusory. This is very similar to a form of philosophical pantheism. And Plato seems to be merging both by saying, well, both of them are true. You do have a pluralistic, ever-changing material reality, but you have this ideal world which is separate that does conform to the unitary monistic viewpoint. So now you have these two ideas. And as a matter of fact, you do see this change in Vedic philosophy, in which you have the world of the Vedas, which is more pluralistic, and suddenly you have the Brahminical era, which starts taking a lot of the concepts from the Vedas and making them be a reflection of a true universal eternal reality. So you would have things like Vaikunta, which is the spiritual world, in the Brahminical view, being a reflection of an actual Vaikuntha in the material world. So you have Vishnu and Vaikuntha in the material world, and then you have another Vaikuntha with another Vishnu, and that is the real one, and this one being just a reflection. That seems to be an evolution of the thought, or at least our interpretation of a lot of the Vedic philosophy. And I've always found that interesting because you see that in Plato as well. He solves an apparent contradiction by making it a reflection of a non-contradiction, of a perfect source of all forms. Now, this also has political implications. The author discusses how the nature of people and their duties assumes an eternal foundation, meaning it's not only what you do here, which is temporal or circumstantial, but now there is an eternal form of your duties in the eternal realm. So Plato's caste system becomes an eternal caste system. Again, this is very similar to Varnashram in India, which you do have a form here of it, but then you have a prototype, which is spiritual and eternal. And you could argue that the form that we see here in the material world is not as complete or pure as it is in the realm of forms. Now, to have a good understanding of the political basis of Platonic thought, and you'll see how this relates to the Christian conception of social justice and social participation, I'm going to read a quote from this book, which I think is very good. Plato shows how radical democracy eventually breeds tyranny. On the political level, excessive freedom encourages citizens to overindulge their appetites. In time, such citizens become incapable of moral self-regulation. All discipline is lost and all resources squandered. In the end, they are compelled to put a tyrant over themselves so that they will be assured, so they think, of a steady stream of pleasures and delights. So you see there that an absolute conception of freedom, of choice within a realm of change and evolution and devolution, because both are possible in the system, breeds eventually chaos and destruction, because unfettered choices can never be that great. Why? Because there is a realm of forms which have a pure manifestation of these choices. But we don't know because we are in this realm of chaos and apparent disorder. But here the key of remembering is everything. For Plato, we existed prior to our earthly life, so that we were in the realm of forms already. And the earth is basically a process, a canvas for progression. So in the Christian system, a soul is created the moment of conception. Traditional Christianity does not believe in pre-existence, although the Latter-day Saints do believe in pre-existence, which is interesting, but that's a separate topic. But most mainstream normative Christianity does not. But Plato did believe in pre-existence, and as a matter of fact, he uses this to explain the nature of our particular birth and why we're sometimes born in different scenarios and circumstances. I will call it a light explanation to the problem of evil. But in Plato's system, it becomes important to advocate for the recycling of souls, reincarnation, because the soul has to progress, and therefore he's going to have a lot of chances at the bat to keep at it, to keep morphing, to keep improving. In this front, I want to quote another part of the book that I think is relevant. Now, this is quoting Plato directly. No one who in obedience to the laws believed that there were gods ever intentionally did any unholy act or uttered any unlawful word. But he who did must have supposed one of three things. Either that they did not exist, which is the first possibility, or secondly, that if they did, they took no care of man, or thirdly, that they were easily appeased and turned aside from their purpose by sacrifices and prayers. Now, I love this quote from Plato. I've always liked it from the first time I ever read it. The reason is because it's a very practical, very straightforward way of addressing bad behavior. Morality is objective from the perspective of Plato and or religion, and therefore we are compelled to do these things from an inner sense of righteousness, but it's based on faith, meaning of fidelity to God. Faithfulness is connected to our behavior. So he's arguing if we don't do what is right, it is because we either don't believe that God exists, and therefore it doesn't matter, or he does exist, but he doesn't care about us, which is kind of like the deistic, post-industrial revolution view of God, which justifies bad behavior, or that we can easily appease God, and he will be turned aside from his justice by said appeasement. Now, he mentions sacrifices and prayers, which is very interesting, because in Protestant theology, Jesus Christ sacrifices himself and places himself in the position of human beings to eat the wrath of God's justice. So the reason that people behave bad in the modern world is because of this deistic position, the atheistic position, or the Protestant position. Oh, Jesus already did a sacrifice for me, so I am not required to do actions, to do behaviors. That position falls into that third category, which is to me fascinating because Plato is predicting how moderns are going to start dealing with God. Now, of course, the fourth option is to believe that God is real and that God cares and God is immanent, and therefore our behavior matters, that our behavior is part of a necessity for exaltation and advancement. And God is there to guide us and to bless us, but also he is looking, he is watching, and therefore we must comport. That is Plato's view, and that is actually the traditional Christian view as well. These 3 points are actually a modern manifestation, but of course they did exist at Plato's time, which is why he's putting it out there. Fascinating. I just wanted to point that out. Going in this framework here, ancient religions believed, for the most part, that there was a substrata of eternal things, elements, spirit, that later on a demiurge of some kind, either the first self-aware consciousness or a generated consciousness, fashioned everything together to create things. So I haven't seen really an ancient religion, and I would argue not even the Old Testament, that believed in ex nihilo creation. Now I know this is controversial because most normative Christians and rabbinical Jews will strongly disagree with my point, and they will point at verses in the Old Testament to argue, see here, he's creating out of nothing. But I will argue that that is part of a hermeneutic infrastructure, a form of reading the text. You could also read it differently, and you could see him as a fashioner from pre-existent things. But either way, you can have one position or the other. That's not my point here. My point is that because of this variation of points of view, the ancient world fits better with the Old Testament if you see it that way, because it is coherent with how the ancient world saw things, making God highly immanent, because he is part of a context. He's not the creator of the context. But I don't think it changes much if you say, well, yeah, but the Bible is special or different. I can respect that. But I'm just saying, by reviewing this book, the author seems to maybe ignore the reality that the ancient world did not believe in ex nihilo creation, and this kind of distorts his point of view a little bit. The author presents mankind as a dual being, and he presents this viewpoint of human beings being like half beast, half soul or spirit as a Christian belief. But I would argue this is not really a traditional Christian understanding of human beings. I think it's a hybrid of Neoplatonic and philosophical speculation. Also, the author is clearly a believer in faith alone. He even argues this, that Plato is ignorant of faith alone, and this is why he makes mistakes. So he's assuming faith alone, which is heretical in the context of traditional Christianity, and it comes through his work, and in my opinion creates a dissonance, because he is arguing already from a modern deviation of traditional Christianity. So his critique of Neoplatonic Christianity and his critique of the philosophers stems from a modern conception of Christianity, which itself is a deviation, so that it would have been more accurate to analyze Plato and his philosophy with the context of traditional Christianity. And this whole faith alone business was completely absent from the ancient world. It was never there. Church fathers didn't see it that way. No matter how many quotes you try to take out of context, it is very clear that the ancient Christian fathers believed in a synergistic system in which actions, behaviors were part of the faith infrastructure. The faith included actions. Works are part of faith. Fidelity means doing something as part of the process of being faithful. Now, interestingly enough, going back to pre-existence, that was part of Origen's viewpoint in the way he explained divine justice. So pre-existence you can find in the ancient world, and even if you think Origen is a heretic, he was one of the great fathers of the time, even though he's not a saint for Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church. But you can find the notions of pre-existence in ancient Christianity, but you will not find faith alone. So, interestingly enough, the book argues for a more open and accessible approach to Plato in his philosophy as being something that if you tweak it, it can fit particularly well with Christian theology. But of course, I think this has always been the case. I think Neoplatonism is deeply embedded in Christianity in one way or another. And I don't think traditional Christians would disagree with that assessment. I would argue that the criticism of the West that the East does is that Aquinas was too deeply influenced by Aristotelian philosophical concepts. But that's a different topic, and that would be a different book. So to close this review, I just want to read a last quote, which again, I think it's indicative and really presents the general gist of the work. Now here he's quoting C.S. Lewis, which he involves in the work, although only at the end in a very short chapter. I wish he would have done more on C.S. Lewis. I think it would have been a very interesting inclusion. But ironically, what he's quoting from C.S. Lewis actually goes against the very idea of faith alone, which I think is kind of funny and fascinating. Every time you make a choice, you're turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. In taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing into a heavenly creature or a hellish creature, either into a creature that is in harmony with God or with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God and with his fellow creatures, and with itself. To be the one kind of creature is heaven, that is, it is joy and peace and knowledge and power. To be the other means madness, horror, idiocy, rage, impotence, and eternal loneliness. Each of us at each moment is progressing to the one state or the other. So there you can see the concept of progression, which Plato would have agreed with, of a process of exaltation, a process of deification or theosis. And that process requires good choices and synergy with God, which again places you outside of that three-legged category: atheist, faith alone, and the deism of the center, which is the pragmatic, God created the world like a clockmaker and then left it alone and we can do whatever we want. We're left to our own devices kind of viewpoint. So even though the author seems to be in a particular camp without necessarily noticing it, I do think this work is really good to make you think about these things, especially for people who are not very familiar with Plato and maybe not even familiar with Christianity. It will give you a very cool combination of thoughts and ideas. But like I said, it's up to you what you do with the information, how you perceive it. Again, I always give my particular opinion on things. That's the whole point of having a channel. But you can disagree with me, put it in the comments, and we can have a friendly discussion. I don't mind it at all that people disagree with me, obviously. And I'm always open to read other books that may change my mind or give me a new perspective. So always recommend books if you think I should read something different. I would greatly appreciate that interaction there also. So again, please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video, and click the bell for notifications if you want to get a nudge when I post a new video. So thank you for being with me. See you next time.